Welcome to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast, where each week we bring you selected content from the magazine for your encouragement and edification. Here at the Banner of Truth in the month of February, we have something of a focus on the Covenanters. And I'm delighted today to be joined on the podcast by one of the Banner of Truth trustees, the Reverend Dr. David Whitla. David is Professor of Church History at the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But he doesn't hail from there. We're going to hear from him in just a moment where he comes from. And I was delighted to get David on the podcast, partly because although we've had trustees on before in terms of featuring sermons from trustees like Reverend Warren Peel and Reverend Ian Murray, we've never had a podcast live with a trustee. So, David, thank you for joining us. Could you, by way of introduction, tell us where you're from and also the origins of your connection to the Covenanters?
Certainly. Thank you, Josh, for having me on the podcast today. As you did mention, I currently teach in North America, but I do come from Northern Ireland, and I was raised there. I was born in Scotland and in Argyllshire, and which is somewhat Covenanting country, but I was raised with a knowledge of the Covenanters from an early age. I was raised in the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Ireland, and of course that is a denomination that has very strong ties to the Scottish Covenanting movement of the 17th century. So I was raised with fireside stories of Covenanter martyrs, and often would visit the sites of the martyrs in places like Edinburgh and Wigtown and other places in Dumfriesshire. So that's certainly much part of my DNA.
And I imagine that among our listeners, we'll have some who, like you, were raised with fireside stories of the Covenanters, and we'll have others, perhaps, who have never really considered this movement before. So can I ask you, who were the Scottish Covenanters?
Well, the Scottish Covenanters were 17th century Scottish Presbyterians who bound themselves by a public covenant to establish a national church that was Reformed in theology, Presbyterian in polity, of course, and I would also add Puritan in piety. And their vision was a national one for Scotland that eventually expanded to include the whole British Isles, the three kingdoms as they were then known in England, Scotland, and Ireland. We usually divide up the history of the Covenanters into two periods. We might talk about the history of the early Covenanters, which goes from about 1638, when that national covenant was signed, up until 1660. And that's the period where they are in political power. That's the period of covenanting triumph, we might say, where they do bring about what came to be known as a Second Reformation in Scotland. And that national movement quickly spread to England and to Ireland as well through a second covenant known as the Solemn League and Covenant. And they basically allied themselves with the English Puritans to wage war against a tyrant king who was seeking to impose his will not only on the nation politically, but also on the consciences of his subjects through the church. Then in the 1650s, you have years of fragmentation, and the alliance falls apart with the rise of Oliver Cromwell and the independence, and we see eventually the collapse of that covenanting consensus. And that's what brings us to the period of the later Covenanters. And I think probably that's the period that most of your listeners may have some familiarity with. This goes from 1660 with the restoration of Charles II, all the way through to 1688 and the Glorious Revolution. And I say it's a better-known story because many have heard those fireside chats about covenanting martyrs and the killing times, where a remnant faithful to that initial covenanting vision continues to hold on in Scotland despite some very severe persecution at the hands of the forces of the Stuart regime. And they withstood everything that the regime threw at them, many of them going into exile, many being imprisoned and suffering fines, and many others tortured and executed as well. And that's the period, again, I think that even if you were to stop people in the streets in Edinburgh and mention the Covenanters, they may have some national memory of the martyrs.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That's a wonderful summary. So you mentioned that there is a connection to the Scottish Reformation, and we're talking, about 100 to 150 years on here. Could you detail that for us? What are the what connection is there theologically in terms of the movement, in terms of church polity, with that Scottish Reformation of the 16th century?
Well, if we're going to talk about a second Reformation in Scotland, that assumes, of course, a first Reformation. And the Scottish Covenanters very much saw themselves as heirs of that first generation of Scottish reformers. So men like Patrick Hamilton, the martyr, and George Wishart, who also was martyred. And of course, we think of John Knox, who's almost synonymous with the Scottish Reformation, people like that. So we need to know the backstory, and it is the First Reformation, which came somewhat late to Scotland compared with other parts of Europe. Various reasons for that. Certainly politically, Scotland in the 16th century was very much a political satellite of Catholic France. The King James V, who was on the throne when the Lutheran preachers first appeared in Scotland, was married to Mary de Guise, and if you know the de Guise family, that was a very powerful French noble family that had the blood of tens of thousands of Huguenots on their hands. And so you have a system in Scotland that is very much antithetical to the new heresy, as they called it, coming into the land. But we have 50 years of struggle between, let's say, 1517, where we usually begin the Reformation, to about 1567, a struggle to bring the Reformation into Scotland. And that's largely through the work of preachers like, again, I mentioned Hamilton and Wishart and Knox, but also through the political maneuverings of Protestant nobles, many of whom were, we believe, genuinely converted through the preaching of the gospel. Others perhaps with nationalistic sentiments who saw Protestantism as a good opportunity to overthrow the hegemony of the French nobility. But it culminated in the late 1550s when a group of nobles banded themselves together in a covenant. And that's important for us with the story we're telling today. We shouldn't think of the Scottish Covenanters as coming up with some new innovation with a public covenant. This was actually a practice that went back into the Middle Ages, as nobles would often band themselves together for various political ends. And here we have a group of Protestant nobles who called themselves the Lords of the Congregation. They made a covenant in 1557 to never cease to establish the Lord's Congregation in Scotland. And by that they meant bring a Protestant Reformation there. Now, the story has often been told of Mary, Queen of Scots, and all of the shenanigans that went on with her trying to establish her throne. The end result, of course, was that the French were driven from Scotland. In 1560, you have the Great Reformation Parliament, which accepts a Scots confession that is thoroughly Protestant in nature. There is a first book of discipline that seeks to restructure the church of the Middle Ages that had been along Presbyterian lines. And there's a great emphasis on education, a great emphasis to try to establish particularly seminary education to meet the deficit of pastors that then existed. So things did begin well. 1567, Mary, Queen of Scots is ousted, and things look positive. But the following 70 years, as we lead up to the Scottish Covenanter movement, is another struggle, 1567 to 1637. And the struggle here is how to establish Reformation in Scotland, how to strengthen that national church. As I mentioned, there were very few ministers. There was a need to educate the nation. Seminary education was generally performed through the universities of St. Andrews and Glasgow. The University of Edinburgh came into existence in this period as well. But beyond that, the actual worship of God in the local churches went through a remarkable transformation. The establishment of the ordinary means of grace, and particularly the primacy of expository preaching, ensured that many came to embrace this new faith. And in many ways, the Reformation was a grassroots movement as opposed to simply a political movement from above. And in this 70-year struggle, the key names are men like Andrew Melville, who returned from teaching on the continent to be president at the Glasgow University and penned the second Book of Discipline. Robert Rollock, the first principal of Edinburgh University, who was a very important figure in the development of covenant theology in the 16th century. There was Robert Bruce, the great court preacher of James VI, and David Calderwood, the Presbyterian polemicist, and Alexander Henderson, the great preacher. Many key names and people that are worth knowing. But despite these encouragements, you do have the gradual undermining of many of these gains, particularly with the rise of James VI. He was an infant when he first was crowned, and so there was a long period of waiting under Protestant regents. But when he came to power, King James VI went a long way to undermine the church. He was a staunch Protestant. In fact, he and his family even signed a covenant in 1581, sometimes called the King's Covenant, by which he and the royal family renounced Romanism. He was raised a Calvinist and apparently seemed to be a very strong Calvinist all of his life. When he later became King of England, he even sent a delegation to the Synod of Dort to defend the Calvinist party there. But if there's one thing James wasn't, it was Presbyterian. He had a great resentment of Presbyterianism, and he even wrote a book against it, defending the divine right of kings, called Basilicon Doron. And the goal that he had for his kingdom was Erastianism. It may not be a term that all of your hearers are familiar with, but it basically means that church government and church worship in a nation is determined by the government, essentially. And so the way he tried to bring religious uniformity in Scotland, and later as King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, was to control church government by the appointment of bishops. So the Presbyterian system came under great threat by prelacy, the establishment of hierarchical bishops, basically the king's yes men, not elected elders, who would ensure that the king's will was done in the theology and the practice of the church. And as his reign neared its end in 1618, he really made some great steps towards changing the worship of the church. In a somewhat stacked General Assembly in Perth in 1618, 5 articles were passed by which all Scottish Presbyterians were required to kneel at the Lord's table to receive the elements. They were required to go back to observe the medieval holy days. They were to accept private baptisms and private communions and this kind of thing. And this brought great dismay to those who had fought so hard to purify the worship of God. All of this became much more intense with the rise of Charles I, his son, who had 11 years of personal rule without his parliament and was much less diplomatic than his father, persecuted the Puritans in England, persecuted the Reformed Church in Scotland, largely through the work of his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. And Laud's purpose was to establish Arminian theology, episcopal rule, and Anglican ceremonies on the Presbyterian Church. So by the dawn of the Covenanting period, 1632, it's clear that a second Reformation was needed. The first Reformation was definitely their heritage, but there was work still to be done, and that's where the Scottish Covenanters come in.
Very helpful. Thank you, David. So you've begun to paint a picture for us there of encroachment of the state into the church's affairs, touching worship, touching doctrine, touching the government of the church. But there were some flashpoints, weren't there? This situation continued to become pressurized. So what were some of the key events that led up to the National Covenant of 1638 actually becoming a reality and getting signed?
Well, I mentioned Archbishop William Laud, and William Laud decided that he would impose upon the Reformed Church of Scotland several documents that would enforce the king's will for uniformity of worship in his three kingdoms. The first of these was a book of canons in 1636, which would bring conformity between the English and the Scottish Church. And really it was an effort to dismantle the structure of the Scottish Reformed Church. For instance, it established a bishop's court of high commission, which was kind of like a personal inquisition for the Anglican bishops. And it wasn't long before many faithful ministers began to fall foul of the bishop's will. Probably the best known example in these years was Samuel Rutherford, the minister of Anwath, and how he was called before the Court of High Commission and banished from his church to Aberdeen. And this kind of thing became increasingly common. Of course, we are grateful for the Lord's providence because that particular action blessed us with the marvelous letters that Rutherford wrote. But this time of suffering did produce many great works, and Rutherford's letters is just one. There are others we could mention. There is increasing suppression in 1636 and 37 of Presbyterian ministers, not just by ejecting them from their pulpits, but also by preventing rising stars from obtaining ordination by their presbyteries. Someone like George Gillespie, for instance, was hindered from seeking ordination by the Archbishop of St. Andrews. He was in Fife at the time. And so all of these brakes are being put on anyone who might threaten the king's will. Well, the final straw came with the Book of Common Prayer in 1637, the Scots Prayer Book, sometimes nicknamed Laud's Liturgy. And this brought great liturgical innovation, which was seen by Presbyterian Scots to be a return to the medieval liturgies. Very similar to the medieval Roman Catholic Missal in many ways, with altars and set prayers. Ministers were forbidden to pray extemporaneously from the pulpit. There were readings from the Apocrypha. Of course, there was the medieval calendar of holy days that had to be observed. And all ministers were commanded by royal decree to purchase 2 copies for their parish churches. And then the great blunder of the government was to announce the date on which it was to be used for the first time, 23rd of July, 1637. And that, of course, gave time for organised opposition to be rallied. And there were riots in Edinburgh. And there are very famous scenes, very well documented, of Dean Hannay of Edinburgh climbing the steps of the pulpit in St. Giles Kirk. And as soon as he began to read from the Scots Prayer Book, he was pelted with stones and stools and sticks. Many of us have heard the tale of Jenny Geddes picking up her stool and hurling it at his head and saying, "Foul fiend, are you saying a mass in my ears?" And so the prayer book was boycotted in churches all across Scotland, and Scotland was in uproar. The king saw this as treason and threatened force and demanded arrests, but he delayed his response, and that gave an opportunity for organized resistance to take place. Powerful nobles come into play at this point in our story. The Earl of Loudon, the Marquess of Argyll, very powerful noblemen take their stand against the king and offer leadership to this movement, alongside some very critical ministers, men like David Dixon, Alexander Henderson. These men remained in Edinburgh for several months to establish a rival executive and actually began a series of petitions to the king, asking him firmly but respectfully to respect the consciences of his subjects in the Northern Kingdom. They were crafted by a brilliant young lawyer, Archibald Johnston, who was very familiar with the law of the land, particularly those laws that had established the First Reformation, and they demanded an end to prelacy. They demanded that the Book of Canons and the Prayer Book be removed and a return to those First Reformation goals as established by law. The thing that really strikes historians in this part of our story is just how remarkably united the kingdom was. All levels of society, from nobles and ministers down to the commoners, were united against King Charles's reforms. And again, they decided the best way for them to organize themselves was to return to that practice of banding or covenanting. And so the Scottish National Covenant was written by Archibald Johnston and Alexander Henderson. It's a pretty lengthy document. It's not an altogether readable document in places. The first section of it is simply a reiteration of the King's Covenant of 1581, reminding the king that his own father had declared himself to be a reformed monarch. The second section is the tricky section. It's basically a list of legal statutes that Archibald Johnston had discovered, reviewing the rights of the General Assembly as established by Parliament, and basically proving that the king had broken the law. And then the third section, which is really the heart of the document, is that all those who signed it swore before God that they would maintain the freedom of the church from civil control, that they would defend the Reformed religion even to the death, and to decline the recent innovations in worship until a General Assembly of the church had passed a judgment upon them. And this was signed in scenes of public worship and great revival, actually. And again, these are all very well documented. So this is where the Solemn League, where the National Covenant came from. They didn't wait very long for the king to respond. They got straight to work, called a General Assembly in Glasgow the same year, and that is considered the high point of the Scottish Second Reformation. The great General Assembly of Glasgow swept away these innovations in worship, condemned the prayer book. The king's bishops were tried in a lawful court of the church and deposed from their positions of authority, and Presbyterianism was reestablished as the national church. They did, of course, have to face a king who was not going to take this lying down. There were a series of wars that took place, brief wars, engagements with the king. The Army of the Covenant faced off against the king in the Bishops' Wars in the next 2 years, and Charles had to basically be brought to terms. And of course, we're now looking into the British Civil Wars, and things were turning sour between the king and his English Parliament. And so there was a war that broke out, as we know, between the English Parliament and the monarch, and the Scots joined forces with the English Parliament, signing the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643, by which they sought to export their Second Reformation to the three kingdoms of Britain against Charles' wishes. Part of that included sending commissioners to join the Westminster Assembly of Divines, as English Puritans and Scottish Covenanters worked together to establish a confession of faith and catechisms, a directory for worship, and yes, a form of church government that would bind the three kingdoms together as a reformed nation.
It's remarkable, isn't it, that there was such unity, and even prior to 1643 and the Westminster Assembly coming together, there was a real clarity about what the church was for, how it was constituted by Scripture, and the limits and scope of the state's power. Very remarkable. Now, I wonder if you can bring us now into the second half of the covenanting story, which isn't quite so triumphal, isn't quite so it's much more gritty. The Covenanters would go on to face some of the worst, if not the worst, persecution against the gospel that has ever been seen on in these British Islands. Could you trace the line from this time of relative victory to what would become known as the killing times? Why was it that the Covenanters ended up facing such fierce and unrelenting and lengthy persecution?
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, the alliance between the English Puritans and the Scottish Covenanters sadly fell into disarray in the 1650s. In the aftermath of the defeat of Charles I, Charles, of course, was put on trial. He was executed by the Parliament, and Cromwell, of course, came to dominance in this time. Cromwell was one who actually had signed the Solemn League and Covenant, but like many of his independent brethren, was not willing to be bound by a uniformity that was Presbyterian, and so enforced toleration of all gospel-believing churches in the 1650s. A different vision from that of the Scottish Covenanters. But sadly, the battlefield that had once been occupied by an alliance of Puritans and Covenanters made way for a battlefield in which English Puritans and Scottish Covenanters fought one another. As soon as Charles I's head had rolled from his body, the Scots were horrified and made overtures to his son, the future Charles II, who was going to be the arch-persecutor. And it was said that they compelled him to sign the Scottish covenants voluntarily. That was Robert Douglas's words. They went and they said, "We will give you your throne because you are the next in line if you will sign the covenants and you will establish this covenanted reformation in the three kingdoms." And Charles I, of course, proved to be utterly duplicitous in this. He signed the covenants as one of the terms of him coming back to Scotland. The Scots Presbyterians crowned him at Scone in 1650. In fact, I think I'm right in saying it's the only time in British history that a Presbyterian government has crowned a British monarch. And so they had a futile attempt at trying to reestablish his throne. Cromwell invaded, crushed the Covenanter army at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, and ultimately Charles would be driven from the field at the Battle of Worcester the following year into exile once more. So the 1650s sees the Covenanter ranks divided among themselves on all of this fiasco. Who was to blame? They all acknowledged that God's judgment was upon the land. And so what had been a united front of nobles and ministers and commoners begins to unravel under an English occupation. All of this sets the stage for the restoration of Charles II in 1660, this time, of course, at the behest not only of a Scottish delegation, but an English delegation as well. And understandably, after a period of turbulence and civil war, there were concerns in England and Scotland of what kind of a king he would be. And so they went and presented their terms, and he made a declaration from his position of exile in Breda, the Declaration of Breda, in which he generously offered a free and general pardon to anyone who had fought against the monarchy in the previous decades. And particularly for our interest, he declared a liberty to tender consciences. And he promised that there would be no pressure put on anyone who had a different position on religion, and here was the key words, religion which does not disturb the peace of the kingdom. And of course, that was the loophole. Who decides what kind of religion disturbs the peace of the kingdom? And of course, that was the monarch himself. So he came back. He was crowned king in England on he returned on his 30th birthday, actually. When he landed at Dover, he was presented with a Bible, and he said, "This is that which I treasure above all things on the earth." And he had this great presentation of going to be a godly monarch. But of course, it proved to be a sham. He passed an act of indemnity and oblivion, it was called, which pardoned all acts against the crown since 1637, when the Covenanter Revolution had begun. But that act was never applied in the Northern Kingdom of Scotland. It wasn't long before he re-established a Erastian episcopacy in both England and Scotland. And in a course of just a couple of years, all the work of reformation north and south of the border was swept away. The machinery of persecution was re-established. Courts of high commission were once again given to bishops to try ecclesiastical cases with no possibility of appeal. Persecuting legislation was quickly added to the statute books, sometimes called the Clarendon Code, most notoriously the Act of Uniformity, by which all English ministers were required to use the service book once more, the Book of Common Prayer, that led to the great ejection of the English Puritan ministers, Black Bartholomew's Day, 24th of August, 1662. That story is well known, but perhaps less well known is the great ejection north of the border, which followed from the Acts Recissory, as they were called in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament. It was said while they were drunk in a drunken revel, with a stroke of the pen, removed all statutes going back over decades that had established not only the Second Reformation, but many aspects of the First Reformation as well. And so with all of that set to one side, the stage was now set for anybody who failed to conform to the new establishment to face persecution. And this came quickly in the form of fines initially to compel people to conform. Many Covenanter ministers opted for exile. Many others were imprisoned. Some were tortured. And yes, ultimately, as we get later into the reign of Charles II, the death toll of martyrs begins to climb. Now, Joshua, you asked why. Why did the Covenanters face such a brutal repression? I think a number of things could be said. I think one thing that perhaps maybe a bit more subjective, but I believe that there were personal scores to settle for Charles II with the Scottish Covenanters. I mentioned how they brought him back in 1650 and crowned him, and they compelled him to sign the covenant as a condition of their support. And during those brief months he was in Scotland, he was compelled to sign confessions of his personal sin. He was a notorious playboy prince, he was often seen as, and he was compelled to sign public confessions, not only of his own sins, but the sins of his father and mother, Charles I and Henrietta Maria. And this was utterly humiliating for Charles. And I do believe there was an aspect of revenge here. No sooner did he come to power than Covenanter leaders were arrested, hunted down. The Marquis of Argyll, who had laid the crown on the king's head, was arrested on his way, in fact, to go and congratulate the king and welcome him back. He was thrown in the Tower of London, was beheaded. His famous last words were, "I set a crown on the king's head, and now he hastens me to a crown greater than his own." James Guthrie, one of the great preachers of the covenant, was hanged in the Grassmarket. And Samuel Rutherford was summoned, but was already on his deathbed and wasn't able to make it to trial. Archibald Johnston, the main drafter of the National Covenant, managed to escape, but was hunted down by Charles's spies in France and eventually was also arrested and hanged. So personal scores, very personal with Charles II. But I suppose the main thing we need to say is the reason they suffered was for their faithful adherence to the covenanted Reformation. They took their covenant vows seriously. They had made them before God and considered them perpetually binding, and they could not be revoked. And so to establish a church that was reformed in theology and polity and worship remained their goal to the death. Charles II, incidentally, had the covenants formally disowned by an act of Parliament, and they were burned by the public hangman, because really they were the antithesis of everything Charles II stood for, which was absolutism in church and state. And the spiritual independence of the church was something he had no time for, and purity of worship wasn't something he took seriously at all. We might also say that resistance to the political authority was one of the main considerations. Very frequently, even in contemporary literature, the Covenanters are simply dismissed as political rebels, guilty of sedition and treason against their king. And so Charles II, being committed to divine right of kings and Erastianism, was not going to tolerate that. And the Covenanter vision for church and state was utterly opposed to that. And I suppose we should always say, with any period of persecution in history, there is an ultimate reason why the church is persecuted. If we pull back the curtain of history, we will see that there is another battle going on behind the scenes. And the malice of the devil opposing Christ as he builds his church is constant. There are periods in which we see it more vividly, such as in the killing times. I often think of Revelation chapter 12, the great red dragon, the serpent, who makes war on the woman and the rest of her offspring who bear the testimony of Jesus Christ. And there are times in which we see that particularly vividly. And certainly the killing times would be one of the most obvious of these. So maybe I could address that part of your question, Josh. What were these killing times? Still today in Scotland, you'll find monuments all over the capital and all over the countryside that make reference to this period. What were the killing times? I think academically, most scholars would strictly apply the killing times to actually a very narrow period towards the very end of Charles II's reign, where the gloves came off, 1684, 1685, the last 2 years of his reign, where there were just particularly ferocious bouts of persecution, summary executions taking place prior to the accession of his Roman Catholic brother James II. And of course, James II would continue the same policy as his brother. But the killing times really grew out of one of the ways that the Covenanters responded to persecution, and that is resorting to conventicles. That's not a word that is perhaps commonly used today. It simply means an underground meeting for worship, or I suppose for any purpose. But the point is, these were illegal meetings by which those who had been ejected from their pulpits by the government still fed their flocks, still administered the sacraments according to the confession of faith that they had all adopted and according to the terms of the covenant that they had all sworn. When these men were ejected from their pulpits, they were replaced by Episcopalian men. They were often referred to as the king's curates. And this is where we see the rise of some of those sort of iconic names, the famous outlawed preachers like John Welsh and John Blackadder, Alexander Peden, Donald Cargill, Richard Cameron, James Renwick. And their stories are truly heroic. The ends to which these men went to feed the scattered flock of Christ, particularly in the lowlands of Scotland. And you can, of course, visit their graves and the sites of many of their exploits today. How were these conventicles suppressed? Well, once again, persecuting legislation played a key role. For instance, to pick one example, there was the notorious Bishop's Dragnet Act of 1665, where the king's curates would take a roll call in church to see who was missing. And then, of course, the king's men would go door to door and find who wasn't at church, and they were forced to take the abjuration oath, which declared the king to be supreme in matters ecclesiastical, something no Covenanter would do. And so the prisons began to fill up, the fines began to increase. There was, of course, physical force. The king unleashed his dragoons, his mounted troops, to go to these remote parts where the conventicles were meeting. And you have the tales of evil men like James Turner, Tam Dalyell, Graham of Claverhouse, Bonnie Dundee. These men were notorious in hunting down the Covenanters in the fields. But it wasn't simply a policy of persecution. There was another tactic that the government used. They employed a series of acts known as indulgences, particularly in the 1670s. And by these indulgences, terms were offered to these outlawed ministers to return to their churches and to return to their ministries if they would submit to the authority of the local bishop, if they would promise that in their sermons they would say nothing contrary to the authority of the king. Now, even today, many scholars say this was a very generous gesture by the king, but ultimately it proved to be a schismatic device, very clever, a divide and conquer tactic, because many, of course, did accept the king's indulgence, and this divided the Covenanter ranks. You had the indulged men, as they came to be known, on one extreme. On the other extreme, you had the followers of Richard Cameron, sometimes called the Cameronians, and they resisted not only the indulgences, but the indulged men themselves, and declared it to be a sin to listen to such compromised ministers. And then, of course, there was a whole range of field preachers in between who were willing to still fellowship with indulged men and Cameronians alike. So the Covenanter movement becomes, in a sense, many Covenanter movements at this point, and there's division in the ranks between them, which only adds to the suffering. I think probably the best known and most talked about aspect of the killing times is the resistance that was put forward that was often violent. The Covenanters had a very well-developed theory, or doctrine, I should say, of civil disobedience. And that came from the early Covenanters, men like George Buchanan and like Samuel Rutherford, of course, in his great work Lex Rex. They believed that the king was covenanted with God by a vertical covenant, but also covenanted with his people by a horizontal covenant. And if that covenant was broken, then the people had a covenanted duty to resist that king. And as the persecution increased, the desire to defend themselves and defend their families and defend the covenanted Reformation, even by resorting to arms, became increasingly common. So, for example, you've got the notorious assassination of the Archbishop of St. Andrews, Archbishop James Sharp, in 1679. You have the armed resistance at a conventicle in Drumclog in 1679 as well, where armed troops attacked this worship service, and the men defended their wives and children and drove off the king's troops, leading to the Battle of Bothwell Bridge, the great pitched battle between the king's men and the Covenanters. And then, of course, there was also public testimonies made forth as well, the Sanquhar Declaration, by which they took a stand against tyranny. So the killing times are a very involved period, a very intense period of persecution, and some very famous martyr stories come to us from this time. We think, for instance, of the Wigtown martyrs, where the teenage Margaret Wilson is tied to a stake in the Solway Firth and compelled to watch her elderly sister in Christ be drowned, and then urged to renounce her Covenanter position, which of course she refused to do, and they both perished. John Brown of Priesthill, summarily executed in front of his wife and young children at his farm in Priesthill. The Bass Rock prisoners. The Bass Rock is not a very pleasant place to be, even on a sunny day. And yet there was a notorious prison there where many Covenanter preachers spent many years and suffered greatly. And James Renwick, the last of the Covenanter ministers to be martyred in 1688. All of these stories are part of Scottish lore. They are well-known stories, and they're stories that we need to know. So the killing times and where they came from, I hope that's a helpful synopsis.
No, it's very helpful. Thank you, David. And it's striking, isn't it, that at the end of the day, what we see in these Covenanters who were prepared to pay the ultimate price for their faith is not a primarily political spectacle. They're not libertarians of an active or an armchair variety. Their concern is Christ's glory, isn't it? Their concern is his church. Their concern, you see these wandering pastors holding conventicles, is to feed the flock. And if resistance is necessary to do that, then so be it. But we're looking at Christian believers rather than political activists per se. And that's not a category of person that we encounter all that often in modern society in these discussions. You know, those who care about freedom aren't always those who care about the glory of Christ, are they? So on that note, I wondered if, as we sort of come into land, what can we draw by way of lesson and instruction from the Covenanters, both the early and the latter Covenanters? What lessons do they have to teach us in the 21st century, which in many ways is different, and yet in striking ways is very similar?
Yeah, well, I think a number of things come to mind. One thing is the importance of the doctrine of the kingship of Jesus Christ. All Protestants who are heirs of the Reformation hold, of course, to the threefold office of Christ, of Christ's prophetic office, his priestly office, and his kingly office. But the Scottish Covenanters placed a particular emphasis on the kingly office of Christ and developed this doctrine in some rather unique ways, largely through the fires of persecution. In fact, it's interesting that we have a number of Covenanter martyrs and sufferers writing of how the first Reformation martyrs sealed with their blood the first two offices of Christ, his prophetic and his priestly offices, but it had fallen to them to seal with their blood the kingly office of Christ. What do they mean by that? Well, what they meant was that Christ in his kingly office, we understand, of course, that as the second person of the Trinity, he is king. This is what we call his essential kingship. But they particularly stressed the mediatorial kingship of Jesus Christ, that Christ has received a kingdom from the Father by virtue of his mediatorial work. All things have been put under his feet. He is now King of kings and Lord of lords. And so as they developed this doctrine, they not only saw Christ as king and head of the church, which of course is paramount, that Christ determines how his church should be governed, what his church should believe, and crucially, how his church should worship. So the doctrine of the kingship of Christ as head of the church brought forth a very strong stress upon what is often called the regulative principle of worship, which the Covenanters really saw as sola scriptura applied to the area of ecclesiology. It wasn't a side issue for these people, and in fact they were willing to die for the liberty of the church to follow Christ's command in Scripture and to worship according to its terms. A little more controversially, of course, they also applied the mediatorial dominion of Christ to the civil magistrate because he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so you often will find them in those field sermons preaching from texts like the second Psalm, calling upon the king of the nation that's persecuting them to kiss the Son, to enter into a covenant with the Son, lest they be destroyed in the way. And under Christ, the civil magistrate, they taught, should not hinder the progress of the gospel, but advance it in appropriate ways. I think a related issue, and I've touched on it, is the importance of purity of worship. This is an area where I think evangelicals today particularly can learn a great deal. The Covenanters offer us a refreshing alternative to the hegemony of what we might call performative worship. I've mentioned how the regulative principle of worship was paramount, worship by the book. But the Anglican forms that were imposed upon the Kirk in Scotland, the 5 Articles of Perth I've mentioned, and of course the prayer book of William Laud, stressed performative worship. That is worship performed by clerical professionals, worship leaders, we might say in today's parlance, to the neglect of the participation of the people of God in the congregation. So all the ceremonies, the smells and bells, as they're often described, all of these things were imposed upon the consciences of God's people. And the Covenanters remind us of the importance of purity of worship, to examine the Word of God, to ensure that we are participating in worship that is not being performed on our behalf in a sacerdotal way, by a priestly office, but rather that all of God's people are worshiping Him together. The prayer book, of course, provided fixed liturgical forms, and that's why the Presbyterians of Scotland, generally speaking, preferred directories to liturgies, rather than straitjacketing the prayers of God's people by a set form of prayer. Let the Spirit lead the minister as he leads the congregation and as they all participate and unite their hearts as one. The centrality of preaching, of course, is something the Covenanters had in common with the English Puritans and the first generation of Reformers as well. Interestingly, the Scottish Covenanters are particularly known for their practice of lectio continua preaching, preaching through books of the Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, not all the time, but usually that was the case, and many of those expositions were later published in the form of commentaries. In fact, the Banner of Truth has several of these in print. Some of you will be familiar with David Dixon's work on the Psalms, for example. There are others as well, but these are basically sermons that were written into commentary form, and the centrality of the preached word and studying that word is something we can learn from these men as well. It's maybe a little more controversial, but something I think we learn from the Covenanters is the importance of understanding the right relationship between church and state. And of course, we have to be careful here. We would not expect to draw every lesson that 17th century Scots drew from Scripture and apply them in exactly a one-to-one way with our modern Western world or beyond in the developing world as well. So we do want to be careful about this. But they did draw many of their understandings of church and state from the French Huguenots, for example, and some of their political resistance theories. And we obviously would distinguish between what they wrote and some contemporary writings on these subjects. But take, for instance, the example of principled civil disobedience. The early Covenanters produced many treatises on this. Henderson, Rutherford, Calderwood, Wariston, there's a lot of them there. We have the example they set in 1637. We often think of in our minds of stools being hurled at ministers' heads, but actually most of the time in those early days was spent writing petitions, petitioning the civil magistrate, writing to lawmakers, writing to kings, and asking them to relent in the policies that they were establishing. I think that sets a very good example. We shouldn't rush simply to those extreme examples, which are often dismissed as terrorism. I don't think we can defend the assassination of an archbishop in front of his daughters. I don't think any of us want to emulate that. But we should emulate, I think, their desire to confront civil magistrates when they overstep their margins and they do intrude upon the practices of the church. The conventicles are, of course, a good example to follow as well. Acts 4:19 is a principle they took very much to heart. Judge for yourselves whether it is better for us to obey God rather than man. If the magistrate says you may not worship God this way, you worship God this way. You obey God rather than man. And of course, that's an example that I think we should be willing to follow. Self-defense principles, there are other things there that perhaps become a little more ambiguous. They are perhaps ambiguous to us in the Western world, but these are not academic matters for our brothers and sisters who presently suffer in other parts of the world. And that's really the last thing I would say that we can really learn from these brothers and sisters of old. They provide, I think, a very helpful example of how to endure persecution under tyrannical regimes. Now, I'll leave it to your hearers to decide whether we live under tyrannical regimes today or not. But this, again, is not academic for many of our brothers and sisters in the Muslim world, for example, those living under communist regimes today. As we've given a brief tour of Covenanter history here, we notice that the civil magistrate in their day made really two different attacks on the church. One was an assault on conscience, and the other was an assault on viable church life, being able to publicly and freely worship God. The Covenanters offered a polemical response to the assault on conscience. They maintained a public testimony to the claims of Christ even while an underground church. They bore testimonies. They wrote testimonies. They nailed them Luther-like to market crosses across Scotland. And they didn't simply stay low and wait till it all went away, but they continued to maintain a prophetic voice to the powers that be. I think that's something that is very powerful. And it's something I think actually that is easier in our digital age for underground churches to perform. And then, of course, they offered a practical response to that assault on viable church life. We've discussed the conventicles. They organized themselves into praying societies in the 1680s as another way to maintain viable church life. And, of course, the examples of courage that they display for those who are suffering persecution today, young and old, men and women, are marvelous. And we need to teach our young people particularly, I think. Those fireside stories of my youth, it's more than simply a sentimental memory. But it's important that we teach our young people the costliness of following Christ, of taking up our cross and following him. It's the best life. It will endure suffering. Somebody once confronted, it was either Donald Cargill or Richard Cameron, I can't remember which, and confronted him and said, you're being too strict. We will all get heaven in the end. So why all this to do? Why all this standing firm and suffering so much? And he said, no, we will get more than heaven. We will get Christ glorified on earth, which is greater than heaven. And that's something I think that we need in our comfortable age to hear. What is the cost of following Christ in our generation? And what lengths are we willing to go to as these Covenanters did?
So crucial and such a helpful setting out of both the Covenanter history and some key lessons. And I'm reminded of what Ian H. Murray often says, that Satan hates church history. Because it's there that we find, Satan only has a limited playbook. He comes back to the same stratagems again and again. And so we need to be learning from the ways in which the Holy Spirit has led God's people through the centuries. So thank you for helping us to do that, David. And look out, please, for in the coming few weeks, throughout the month of February, we'll be posting a number of videos going into some of these stories in a little less detail, but taking you to some of the locations where these great martyrs operated, served God, and then in many cases paid the ultimate price for their faith. So we look forward to bringing that to you as the Banner of Truth. Thank you very much, David Whitla, Banner Trustee and Professor of Church History at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, for being with us, for your time, for your clarity, and for your helpful analysis. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. Pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you for listening to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast. To subscribe to the magazine in print or digital formats, or both, see the show notes or visit banneroftruth.org.